Hey everybody, it is Coach Malcolm here, and today for my lesson we are going to be looking at some pretty exciting, some pretty cool and interesting quick mates played by the Black Pieces. So these are real games. None of them are going to go longer than 6 moves, so we're going to be we're going to be on the lookout for checkmate threats, particularly mate in ones, and that also involves looking at what squares the white king has and how we can take all of them and put him in checkmate. All right, so let's get started on our first game. In this game, white starts with pawn to g4, which is kind of a weird move to start off the game with, but black keeps playing relatively normally, plays e6, which would normally be the French if white started off with e4 instead. But g4, e6, and now white makes a big blunder, a big mistake, pawn to f4. I'm sure in club, many of your coaches have told you, don't move Freddy the f-pawn early in the game. It's dangerous for your king, especially when he isn't castled. And this game is going to show us exactly why. So take a second or two. Feel free to pause your video if you need a little bit more time. And try and find the checkmate in one right now for black. All right, hopefully we found queen to h4, checkmate. The queen takes advantage of this very open diagonal, attacking the king on e1, guarding his escape square f2, and the king cannot move to any other squares because they are occupied by his pieces. And just because of the way this knight moves, even if it goes to h3 or f3, which it obviously cannot, it is not able to block this queen. So we have our very nice 2-move checkmate. All right, let us continue on to our next game. So this game, white starts off pawn to e4, black plays pawn d5. This is the Scandinavian defense for black. Pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, and here this still looks like a pretty normal Scandinavian defense, but white makes a big mistake. They play king to e2. This king is exposed. Instead, if we were playing for white, we would want to start to develop our pieces, play moves like knight c3, bishop e3, knight f3, bishop d3, and castle our king. But white makes the blunder of playing king to e2, and now black has checkmate on move 3. See if you can find it. All right, hopefully we see queen to e4. This queen does a great job covering all of the king squares, particularly e2, by putting him in check, and he has nowhere to move because the queen is attacking every square. This queen cannot be captured, and there's no way to block this checkmate, so it is over for white on move 3. All right, so don't bring your king out early in the game. Next up, let's take a look. c4, e5, b3, bishop c5. This bishop is attacking this weak pawn on f2. Let's just notice that first of all. Knight c3, queen f6, also attacking this weak pawn on f2. Let's notice this. Bishop b2, and now white has made a big mistake. They have ignored black's threats with their queen and their bishop. And how is black going to punish them? With a checkmate in one right here on move 4. This is the 4-move checkmate from black's perspective. Say, take a second or two. There are actually 2 checkmate in one. See if you can find both. All right, so in the game, queen takes f2 was checkmate. The king cannot take the queen because she is very well supported and guarded by her bishop, and he's obviously in check, and he has no other squares to move to because they are occupied by his own pieces. You may have found the other checkmate here, which is bishop takes f2. Similarly, the bishop is guarded by the queen, attacks the king, and the king he has nowhere to go. All right, next up, pawn to e4, pawn to e5, f4. So we should notice immediately, we know this is a bad move because of Freddy the f-pawn is moving off his home square early on. We saw in the first game how badly this worked out for white, and spoiler alert, it's not going to work out very well this time either. So bishop c5, very similarly attacking this weakness on f2, especially because that pawn is gone. Pawn takes e5, queen h4 check, a very forcing move, taking advantage of this open diagonal. White plays king e2 here, very similar to one of our last positions. How can we, as black, checkmate on move 4? Right, hopefully we see queen takes e4 checkmate. The bishop does an excellent job guarding f2, and the queen guards f3, d3, e3, e1, and this king is obviously in check on e2. There's no way, again, to block the checkmate. The queen cannot be taken. So white has lost this game, again, by opening up their f-pawn and bringing their king out. So there's a lot to learn from white's mistakes. All right, next up, pawn to c4, knight f6, knight c3, e6, e4. This still looks like a pretty normal game. White can play e4. It's supported by their knight on c3. Knight c6, continuing with development. Knight e2. Let's notice that white has sort of cramped himself in. So this is going to come into play a little later on. Black plays b6 here. Maybe they're planning to fianchetto their bishop on b7. G3, white is probably planning the same thing, but here black changes up their plan a little bit and makes a very serious threat, knight to e5. And white fails to notice the threat, pawn d4, and how can we take advantage of white's failure, white's blunder? Do you see the threat that black was trying to make last move? Take a second or two, consider how black can checkmate in one. Right, hopefully we see knight f3. The knight attacks the king and his only escape square d2, a beautiful smother mate, and this king is trapped in by all of his other pieces. He has nowhere to go. He can't take this knight, and white has lost on move 6. All right, nope. Next up, pawn b4. This is obviously a pretty strange way for white to start off the game, but let's continue. Pawn c6, bishop b2, queen b6. So both sides are playing pretty peculiar starts to the game of chess. Pawn b4 is an odd move, and usually we don't like to bring our queen out so early, but both white and black have done these things. So pawn a3, obviously guarding this pawn on b4. Black decides to attack the pawn on b4 with a5. White plays c4. Here, black plays e6, opening up their bishop to attack b4 as well. Pawn c5, and here black decides to take on c5. And black's thinking is, well, if my bishop is taken, then I can take this bishop on b2, and I'm attacking this rook, so I have other threats involved. But here, white got too greedy because they played bishop takes g7, trying to win this rook. This is a big mistake. White is ignoring a super large threat from black. How can black checkmate in one, move 6, end the game? All right, hopefully we see bishop takes f2, very similar to one of our other positions. The bishop is supported by the queen. The king obviously cannot take, and he is again trapped in by many of his other pieces. All right. Pawn to f4, new game now. Again, let's just notice Freddy the f-pawn coming out early. This is not going to fare well for white. Pawn e5, pawn takes e5, getting a little greedy. Pawn d6, giving up another pawn. Pawn takes, bishop takes. So black has sacrificed one pawn for development, and they are planning to attack particularly this open diagonal. Pawn g3, queen g5, making a serious threat. White fails to see it. Knight to f3. Now see if you can spot the checkmate in 2 in this position. Okay, not a checkmate in 1, checkmate in 2, taking advantage of this open diagonal right here. Take a few seconds. All right, hopefully we see queen takes g3. White's only response is to take back with the pawn. Bishop takes g3, super pretty checkmate. The white king has no moves. The black bishop on g3 cannot be taken. If you were also thinking bishop takes g3 first, you are correct. White's only move is still to take back, and queen takes g3 is checkmate here as well. Same idea. All right, next up, this is our last game that we're going to be looking at today. Pawn to f4. Hopefully, if you haven't already noticed, pawn to f4 is a starting move. It is called the bird opening. I'm not a big fan of it just because it opens up a lot of threats on this diagonal for the white king, and often leads to an early checkmate if you're playing a very skilled opponent who is good at spotting checkmates and making threats. All right, it looks like my video cut out for a second there, but we're back. So let's finish up with our last game. I was talking about the bird. Pawn to e5, pawn takes e5, d6. This looks very similar to the last game we did, but it'll be a little different. Pawn takes d6, bishop takes, again, sacrificing the pawn for the bishop to be open and able to attack this here diagonal. Here, white played knight f3 instead of g3. Black plays g5, going to attack this knight on g4 and get it away from guarding this square h4, so the queen would be able to come there in the future. Here, white makes the big mistake of playing pawn to h3, and now see if you can find our final checkmate in one for black, taking again advantage of this open diagonal. All right, hopefully we found bishop g3, similar to some of the puzzles we've had. Opening this diagonal, guarding f2, e1, and the king is trapped in by his own pieces. All right, guys, so checkmates are always good practice, so I hope we got to work on those skills in this video, and I also hope we learned that from white's perspective, f4, unless you know the opening the bird very well and very in-depth, it is not a good idea to move your f-pawn, Freddy the f-pawn, early in the game because it opens up your king to all sorts of danger like this position we see here on the board. All right, that's the end of this video. Thank you, everybody.